On the morning of December 7th, 1941, 8 American battleships sat in a neat, predictable row along the southeast shore of Ford Island, and within 90 minutes, the most powerful concentration of naval firepower in the Pacific had been reduced to burning, capsized, shattered steel. What makes that sentence so staggering is not just the speed of the destruction, but the sheer scale of what those ships represented. Each one of those battleships was a floating city, a cathedral of riveted armor plate and massive gun turrets that had taken years to design and years more to build, manned by over 1,000 sailors who lived, slept, ate, and worked inside a machine so complex that its own crew could spend an entire enlistment aboard and never see every compartment. The United States Navy had spent decades and billions of dollars constructing these vessels, and the Japanese Imperial Navy had just demonstrated in less time than it takes to watch a feature film that the age of the battleship was already over. But the story of Pearl Harbor's battleships is not simply a story of destruction. It is a story of engineering, of human error, of extraordinary courage, and of a resurrection so improbable that 5 of those 8 shattered warships would sail again to fight the very empire that tried to destroy them. To understand what was lost that Sunday morning, you first have to understand what a battleship actually was in 1941, because the word itself has lost its meaning in an era of aircraft carriers and guided missiles. A battleship was the most expensive, most powerful, most heavily armored weapon system that any nation on Earth could produce. It was the nuclear deterrent of its age. The logic was simple and had governed naval warfare since the days of the wooden ship of the line. The vessel with the thickest armor and the biggest guns wins. By the early 20th century, that logic had produced warships of almost incomprehensible scale. The battleships moored at Pearl Harbor that morning displaced between 29,000 and 33,000 tons of water. Their main battery guns, arranged in massive turrets that each weighed as much as a destroyer, could hurl shells weighing over a ton to targets more than 20 miles away. The armor belts protecting their sides were over a foot thick in places, hardened steel designed to deflect shells fired by enemy battleships at ranges that would make the distance from one end of a major city to the other look modest. These were not ships in the way most people think of ships. They were mobile fortresses, engineered to absorb punishment that would annihilate any other vessel afloat and keep fighting. The 8 battleships present at Pearl Harbor that morning were not identical. They represented different generations of American naval thinking, different answers to the same fundamental question of how to balance firepower, protection, and speed within the constraints of treaty limits and budget realities. The oldest was USS Nevada, commissioned in 1916, a ship that had been considered revolutionary in her day because she was the first battleship in the world to use oil fuel exclusively and the first to employ the all-or-nothing armor scheme that would define every American capital ship that followed. That concept was elegant in its brutality. Instead of spreading armor evenly across the entire hull, the designers concentrated the thickest possible protection around the vital spaces, the magazines, the engine rooms, the fire control stations, and left everything else essentially unprotected. The logic was that thin armor was worse than no armor at all because it would slow down an incoming shell just enough to arm its fuse and detonate it inside the ship, while truly thick armor could actually stop penetration. Everything in between was a waste of weight. It was a gamble, but it worked. And every battleship the United States built after Nevada followed the same principle. Alongside Nevada sat her near sister Oklahoma, commissioned in the same year, but fitted with reciprocating engines rather than the turbines that powered Nevada, a decision that made Oklahoma slightly slower and considerably more old-fashioned, even by the standards of 1916. Behind them, both chronologically and in terms of capability, came Pennsylvania, the lead ship of her class and the flagship of the Pacific Fleet, a vessel that carried 12 14-inch guns and 4 triple turrets and represented the mature expression of the standard-type battleship concept. Pennsylvania's designers had refined the all-or-nothing scheme and produced a ship that was tougher, more heavily armed, and more capable than Nevada, though she shared the same fundamental limitation of a maximum speed of 21 knots, roughly the pace of a modern recreational sailboat in a strong wind. Arizona was Pennsylvania's sister ship, nearly identical in dimensions and armament, and the two of them formed a pair that the Navy considered among the most capable battleships in the fleet, despite their quarter-century of service. Then there were the ships of Battleship Row's inner column, the vessels moored inboard of others and therefore partially shielded from torpedo attack. Tennessee and her sister West Virginia represented the next step in American battleship evolution, ships that carried 12 and 8 guns respectively of 14 and 16-inch caliber, with improved fire control systems and denser torpedo defense arrangements. Tennessee had been commissioned in 1920 and West Virginia in 1923, making them younger and in many respects more capable than the Pennsylvania-class ships, though they shared the same plodding 21-knot speed that defined every American standard-type battleship. Maryland, West Virginia's sister, sat outboard in the row, Her massive 16-inch guns, the heaviest weapons present that morning, each shell weighing 2,100 pounds and capable of penetrating over a foot of armor at combat range. And finally, California, the lead ship of her class, moored alone at the southern end of Battleship Row, a vessel that some officers considered the finest battleship in the fleet, despite being nearly 2 decades old by the time the first Japanese plane appeared over the harbor. What bound all 8 ships together, beyond their shared identity as battleships, was a design philosophy rooted in the lessons of the First World War and the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922. That treaty, one of the most ambitious arms control agreements in history, had frozen battleship construction among the major naval powers and imposed strict limits on the tonnage and armament of any new capital ships. The result was that the American battleships at Pearl Harbor were essentially pre-treaty or early treaty designs, powerful but slow, built for a style of naval warfare that imagined 2 great battle lines steaming toward each other across open ocean and exchanging broadsides at ranges of 15 to 25,000 yards. Every aspect of their design served that vision. Their thick armor belts were optimized to defeat shells arriving at the angles produced by those engagement ranges. Their fire control systems, intricate networks of rangefinders, mechanical computers, and communication circuits were designed to solve the geometry of hitting a moving target from a moving platform at distances where the curvature of the Earth became a factor. Their propulsion systems prioritized endurance over speed because the decisive battle was expected to take place far from home waters, and a battleship that ran out of fuel before reaching the engagement area was worthless regardless of how fast it could sprint. The men who served aboard these ships lived in a world that was simultaneously impressive and miserable. A battleship crew numbered between 1,200 and 1,600 officers and enlisted men, and the vast majority of those men lived in conditions that would horrify a modern sailor. Enlisted berthing spaces were cramped, humid, poorly ventilated compartments where men slept in canvas hammocks or stacked bunks arranged so close together that rolling over required negotiation with the man in the next rack. The heat below decks in a ship operating in Hawaiian waters was oppressive, often exceeding 100 degrees in the engineering spaces where the boilers and turbines roared. And the men who worked those spaces did so in shifts that left them drenched in sweat and coated in a fine film of oil and grease that never fully washed away. Fresh water was rationed because the evaporators that converted seawater into potable water could not keep pace with the demands of over 1,000 men, so showers were brief and infrequent, and laundry was a luxury. The food was adequate in quantity but monotonous in quality, heavy on canned goods and powdered substitutes, and the mess halls where it was served were crowded, noisy, and smelled of old grease and metal. And yet for many of the young men aboard, particularly those who had enlisted during the Depression, a battleship was the best thing that had ever happened to them. It offered 3 meals a day, a place to sleep, a steady paycheck, and the chance to see the world, or at least the Pacific Ocean, which was more than most of them had known before. The daily routine aboard a battleship at Pearl Harbor in late 1941 followed a rhythm that had been established decades earlier and changed very little. Reveille sounded before dawn, and the crew turned out for morning muster, a head count that verified every man was present and accounted for. Breakfast followed, then the endless round of maintenance, training, and drills that consumed the working day. A battleship was in a constant state of decay, its steel hull and superstructure under relentless assault from salt air and seawater, and the crew fought that decay with wire brushes, red lead primer, and gray paint in quantities that would have supplied a small hardware store. The guns required constant attention, their breeches cleaned and lubricated, their loading mechanisms tested, their fire control instruments calibrated. The engines demanded their own cadre of specialists, men who understood the temperament of boilers that operated at pressures high enough to cut a man in half if a steam line ruptured. And beneath all of this visible activity, the ship's administrative machinery ground along, processing paperwork, managing personnel records, handling pay, tracking supplies, and generating the endless stream of reports that the Navy's bureaucracy demanded with an appetite that rivaled the boiler's hunger for fuel oil. What the men aboard those battleships did not know, and what their commanding officers understood only dimly, was that the world had already changed beneath their feet. The battleship's reign as the supreme arbiter of naval power was ending, and the instrument of its overthrow was the aircraft carrier, a vessel that could project destructive force hundreds of miles beyond the horizon, while the battleship's guns could reach only 20-odd miles at best. The Japanese Imperial Navy understood this better than almost anyone, in part because its own strategists had been thinking about the problem of defeating a numerically superior American fleet for 20 years. The man who would plan the attack on Pearl Harbor, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, had studied at Harvard, had served as a naval attaché in Washington, and had traveled across the United States observing its industrial capacity with the clear-eyed appreciation of a man who knew his own country could never match it. Yamamoto understood that Japan could not win a prolonged war against the United States. The American industrial base was simply too vast, too productive, too resilient. The only chance was a knockout blow, a single devastating strike that would cripple the Pacific Fleet and buy Japan enough time to establish a defensive perimeter so deep and so well fortified that the Americans would choose to negotiate rather than pay the cost of breaking through it. And the obvious target for that knockout blow was the collection of battleships sitting in Pearl Harbor, the visible symbol of American naval power in the Pacific. The plan that emerged was audacious to the point of recklessness. A strike force of 6 aircraft carriers, the largest carrier task force ever assembled, would cross the northern Pacific in winter, avoiding shipping lanes and maintaining strict radio silence, and launch a surprise attack against Pearl Harbor from a position roughly 200 miles north of Oahu. The attacking force would consist of over 350 aircraft in 2 waves, armed with a combination of torpedoes, bombs, and machine guns. The primary targets were the battleships, and the Japanese had devoted extraordinary ingenuity to solving the technical problems that Pearl Harbor's shallow waters presented. Standard aerial torpedoes dove to a depth of 60 feet or more when dropped, which meant they would simply bury themselves in the harbor's 40-foot bottom. Japanese engineers solved this by fitting wooden fins to their torpedoes that stabilized the weapon during its entry into the water and allowed it to run at a depth of only 35 feet, shallow enough to function in Pearl Harbor's confined waters. For the high-altitude bombers, the solution was even more creative. They converted 16-inch armor-piercing naval shells into bombs by fitting them with fins, producing a weapon that could punch through the armored decks of a battleship and detonate inside the ship's vitals, exactly where the designers had assumed only another battleship's guns could reach. The strike force sailed from Hitakapu Bay in the Kuril Islands on November 26, 1941, and for 11 days it moved eastward across the empty northern Pacific, refueling at sea in heavy swells that made the operation dangerous and exhausting. The fleet maintained absolute radio silence, and the crews were told nothing about their destination until they were at sea, a precaution that reflected both the secrecy of the mission and the Japanese Navy's understanding that the element of surprise was everything. If the Americans detected the approaching force and had time to sortie their fleet, the attack would face battleships at sea with their watertight doors sealed and their crews at battle stations. A very different proposition from battleships tied up at their berths with half their crews ashore on weekend liberty. The success of the entire operation depended on catching the Americans completely unprepared, and in this, the Japanese would succeed beyond their most optimistic projections. The morning of December 7th broke clear and warm over Oahu, with scattered clouds at several altitudes and visibility that stretched for miles. It was a Sunday, and the pace aboard the battleships was relaxed in the way that only a peacetime navy in a tropical port could be. Many of the officers and a significant portion of the enlisted crew were ashore, enjoying the bars and beaches of Honolulu and the surrounding towns. Those who remained aboard were sleeping in, eating a leisurely breakfast, or preparing for the mundane routines of a day that promised nothing more exciting than church services and perhaps a baseball game. The ships were not at general quarters, their highest state of readiness. Many of the watertight doors that would have compartmentalized damage in a combat situation were open, because keeping them closed in peacetime was inconvenient and uncomfortable. Ammunition was locked in magazines rather than staged at the guns. The anti-aircraft batteries, the ship's only defense against air attack, were largely unmanned, and in some cases the ready ammunition lockers near the guns were padlocked shut. The fleet was, in every sense that mattered, asleep. The first wave of Japanese aircraft arrived over Pearl Harbor at approximately 7:49 in the morning, and the attack began with a precision that reflected months of planning and rehearsal. The torpedo bombers came in low over the harbor, flying so close to the surface that their propellers nearly touched the water, and released their modified torpedoes at ranges so short that the American sailors watching from the decks of their ships could see the faces of the Japanese pilots. The first torpedo struck USS Oklahoma on her port side at approximately 7:53, and within minutes the harbor was a chaos of explosions, fire, and noise that no survivor would ever fully describe. The torpedo bombers focused their attacks on the outboard ships in Battleship Row, the vessels whose exposed port sides presented clear targets, and the results were devastating. Oklahoma took 5 torpedoes in rapid succession, each one blasting a hole in her hull below the waterline and flooding the compartments beyond faster than the crew could react. Within 12 minutes of the first hit, Oklahoma had rolled over to port and was lying on her side with her masts driven into the harbor mud, her hull rising from the water like the belly of a dead whale. Inside that overturned hull, more than 400 men were trapped in darkness, in compartments that were rapidly filling with water and fuel oil, and many of them would die there in the hours and days that followed. West Virginia, moored inboard of Tennessee, took at least 7 torpedoes on her port side, a concentration of damage that should have produced the same rapid capsizing that destroyed Oklahoma. That it did not was largely due to the actions of a few officers and enlisted men who acted with extraordinary speed and composure in the first minutes of the attack. The senior officer, who took immediate charge, ordered counter-flooding of the starboard compartments, a desperate measure that involved deliberately flooding the opposite side of the ship to counterbalance the weight of water pouring in through the torpedo holes. It was a calculated sacrifice, trading buoyancy for stability, and it worked. West Virginia settled to the bottom of the harbor on an even keel rather than capsizing, which meant that most of her crew could escape over the sides or be rescued from the superstructure. But the ship was finished as a fighting unit. She sat on the harbor floor with her main deck awash, burning from fires, fed by oil leaking from her ruptured fuel tanks, and the water inside her hull entombed dozens of sailors who had been trapped in sealed compartments below the waterline. Some of those men survived for days in air pockets inside the sunken ship, scratching marks on the bulkheads to count the passing time. And rescue teams who later cut through the hull found evidence that at least 3 men had lived until December 23rd, 16 days after the attack, before their air finally ran out. The destruction of Arizona was the single most catastrophic event of the entire attack, and remains the enduring image of Pearl Harbor in the American memory. Arizona was moored inboard of the repair ship Vestal, which provided some shielding from torpedo attack, but she was fully exposed to the high-altitude bombers that made up part of the first wave. At approximately 8:06 in the morning, a modified 16-inch armor-piercing shell dropped from a high-altitude bomber struck Arizona near her number 2 turret, penetrated the armored deck, and detonated in or near the forward magazine, the compartment where the ship's main battery ammunition was stored. What happened next was not an explosion in the conventional sense. It was a detonation, a nearly instantaneous ignition of over 1 million pounds of gunpowder and high explosive that produced a blast so powerful it lifted the entire forward section of the ship out of the water. The fireball rose over 1,000 feet into the air, and the concussion wave was felt by every person in the harbor and by civilians miles away in Honolulu. Arizona's entire forward structure, from the bow to the forward superstructure, was destroyed in less than 9 seconds. The ship broke apart internally, her keel fractured, her forward magazines vaporized, and she settled to the bottom with a speed that gave most of the men in her forward compartments no chance to escape. 1,177 men died aboard Arizona that morning, nearly half of all the Americans killed in the entire attack. Most of their bodies were never recovered and remain entombed in the wreckage to this day, which is why Arizona is not merely a war memorial, but an active grave site, the final resting place of men who gave their lives in the opening minutes of America's entry into the Second World War. The other battleships suffered varying degrees of damage, and the differences in their fates reveal how much the specifics of position, preparation, and chance mattered in the chaos of that morning. Nevada, moored alone at the northern end of Battleship Row, took one torpedo early in the attack and began flooding, but her crew got steam up in her boilers and she became the only battleship to get underway during the attack. Watching Nevada move down the channel under her own power, her guns firing, her hull trailing smoke and flame, was one of the few moments of defiance in an otherwise devastating morning. But her movement also made her a target, because the Japanese pilots in the second wave recognized that a sinking ship in the narrow harbor channel would block the entrance and trap every other vessel inside. They concentrated their attacks on Nevada with a ferocity that reflected the strategic value of sinking her in exactly the wrong place. Bombs struck her bridge, her forecastle, and her superstructure in rapid succession, and fires broke out across the ship that threatened to reach her magazines. Rather than risk blocking the channel, Nevada's captain ordered her run aground at Hospital Point, where she settled into the mud with her superstructure burning, but the channel still clear. It was a decision that sacrificed the ship to save the harbor, and it was exactly the right call. California, moored alone at the southern end of the row, was in an especially vulnerable state that morning because she had been preparing for an inspection, and her crew had opened many of the manholes and access hatches in her double bottom that were normally kept sealed. When 2 torpedoes struck her port side, the flooding spread far more rapidly than it would have in a fully buttoned-up ship, and the counter-flooding efforts that might have saved her were hampered by the open hatches and the confusion of the first minutes. California settled slowly to the harbor floor over the course of 3 days, a gradual sinking that allowed most of her crew to escape, but left the ship a total loss as far as immediate combat capability was concerned. She came to rest on the bottom with a slight list, her superstructure and upper works still above water, looking deceptively intact from a distance, but gutted internally by flooding and fire. Maryland and Tennessee, both moored inboard of other ships, escaped the worst of the torpedo attacks because the outboard vessels, Oklahoma and West Virginia respectively, absorbed the torpedoes intended for them, but both ships were hit by bombs, and both suffered damage from the fires that raged along Battleship Row for hours after the attack. Tennessee was struck by 2 bombs and was also damaged by burning oil that flowed across the water from Arizona's ruptured fuel tanks, creating a river of fire that lapped against Tennessee's hull and superstructure and threatened to set her ablaze. Her crew fought those fires for hours, hosing down the ship's sides with seawater and beating out flames that kept reigniting from the heat of the burning oil. Maryland took 2 bomb hits, but suffered relatively light damage overall, and she would be the first of the damaged battleships to return to service, deploying to the West Coast for repairs and modifications that took only a few months. Pennsylvania, the flagship of the Pacific Fleet, was not in Battleship Row at all. She was in Dry Dock Number 1, undergoing routine maintenance propped up on blocks with the water drained from around her hull. Her position in the dry dock made her immune to torpedo attack but exposed her to bombs, and she was hit by one bomb that caused moderate damage and killed or wounded several members of her crew. The destroyers, Cassine and Downs, sharing the dry dock with Pennsylvania, were hit much harder. Their hulls wrecked by bombs and fires that detonated their torpedo warheads and turned the dry dock into an inferno. Pennsylvania survived the attack in better condition than any other battleship at Pearl Harbor, a fact that owed everything to the accident of her maintenance schedule and nothing to any superior defensive preparation. The second wave of the attack, which arrived approximately 45 minutes after the first, focused primarily on the airfields and installations around the harbor, though it also continued to pound the battleships with dive bombers. By the time the last Japanese aircraft departed, the destruction was staggering. All 8 battleships had been hit. Arizona and Oklahoma were total losses, destroyed beyond any possibility of repair. West Virginia and California had sunk at their berths and would require massive salvage operations before they could even be considered for reconstruction. Nevada had been deliberately grounded to prevent her from blocking the channel. Tennessee, Maryland, and Pennsylvania had suffered significant but repairable damage. The human cost was equally devastating. 2,303 Americans died that morning, with another 1,178 wounded. The majority of the dead were sailors aboard the battleships, and the majority of those were aboard Arizona and Oklahoma. It was the worst single-day loss in American naval history, and it remains so to this day. But the shock of December 7th concealed a series of strategic realities that would become apparent only in the weeks and months that followed, realities that transformed the disaster into something far more complicated than the straightforward defeat it appeared to be. The first and most important of these was what the Japanese had not hit. The 3 aircraft carriers assigned to the Pacific Fleet, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, were all absent from Pearl Harbor on December 7th, either at sea delivering aircraft to island bases or on the West Coast for maintenance. The Japanese had planned to destroy them along with the battleships, and their absence was a stroke of luck so consequential that it arguably changed the outcome of the entire Pacific War. Without those carriers, the United States would have had no offensive capability in the Pacific for at least a year, and the string of carrier battles that halted Japanese expansion at Coral Sea and Midway in 1942 would simply not have happened. The survival of the carriers meant that the American Navy could fight back almost immediately, even as the wreckage of Battleship Row still smoldered. The second overlooked factor was the fuel storage. Spread across the hills surrounding Pearl Harbor were massive tank farms holding 4.5 million barrels of fuel oil, enough to sustain Pacific Fleet operations for months. The Japanese never targeted these facilities, and their destruction would have been far more damaging to the American war effort than the loss of any number of battleships. Without that fuel, the fleet would have been forced to withdraw to the West Coast, adding thousands of miles to every operation and delaying the American counteroffensive by months or even years. The decision not to launch a third wave of attacks, which might have targeted the fuel tanks, the repair facilities, and the submarine base was one of the most consequential choices of the entire war. The Japanese commander, concerned about the whereabouts of the American carriers and the diminishing element of surprise, chose to withdraw with his force intact rather than risk a counterattack. It was a cautious decision that made tactical sense in the moment but strategic nonsense in the longer view, and Japanese officers would debate it for the rest of their lives. The third factor was the harbor itself. Pearl Harbor's shallow water, the same characteristic that had nearly made it unsuitable for the torpedo attack, turned out to be a blessing for the Americans. In deep ocean water, a sinking battleship plunges to the bottom and is lost forever, its hull crushed by pressure, its salvage impossible with any existing technology. But Pearl Harbor's 40-foot depth meant that the sunken battleships were sitting on the bottom with their superstructures, and in most cases their main decks, still above water or only slightly submerged. They had not been lost. They had been damaged, severely and catastrophically in some cases. But they were still physically present, still accessible, and in theory still repairable. This realization dawned on the Navy's salvage experts within days of the attack, and it set in motion one of the most extraordinary engineering undertakings of the entire war. The salvage of Pearl Harbor's battleships was a project of staggering complexity that lasted for over 2 years and involved thousands of workers, military and civilian alike, laboring in conditions that were dangerous, exhausting, and psychologically harrowing. The first task was simply to clear the wreckage and establish what could be saved and what could not. Arizona was abandoned almost immediately. The magazine explosion had so thoroughly destroyed her forward structure that reconstruction was deemed impossible. and her after turrets, though relatively intact, were eventually removed and their guns were remounted in shore batteries that defended Oahu for the rest of the war. The ship herself was left where she sank, a decision that was as much emotional as practical, since her hull still contained the remains of over 1,000 men. Oklahoma presented a different problem. She had capsized, rolling completely over until her masts were embedded in the harbor bottom, and the task of righting a 30,000-ton ship that was upside down in 40 feet of water was something that had never been attempted before. The solution the salvage engineers devised for Oklahoma was ingenious and brutal. They drove 21 massive steel frames called bents into the harbor bottom alongside the capsized hull, each one rising above the waterline, like the rib of some enormous steel animal. From the tops of these bents, they strung wire cables over the hull and attached them to purchase points that divers had welded onto the ship's exposed bottom. Electric winches mounted on Ford Island then pulled the cables slowly, inch by inch, rotating the hull back toward an upright position. The process took 3 months of continuous pulling, and the forces involved were enormous. At several points, the cables snapped under loads that exceeded their rated capacity, and the entire operation had to be paused while new rigging was arranged. But it worked. Oklahoma was righted, dewatered, and floated off the bottom, revealing the full extent of her torpedo damage and the grim reality of her interior. The bodies of over 400 men were recovered from inside the hull, many of them in compartments that showed evidence of prolonged survival after the capsizing. Men who had lived in darkness inside the overturned ship for hours or days before drowning or suffocating. Oklahoma was deemed too old and too badly damaged to justify reconstruction, and she was eventually sold for scrap. While being towed to the west coast for breaking in 1947, she sank in a storm and lies today on the Pacific floor, a final resting place that seems almost fitting for a ship that had already been to the bottom once before. The other sunken battleships received very different treatment. West Virginia and California were patched, pumped out, refloated, and towed to dry docks where the full scope of their damage could be assessed. What the engineers found was sobering but not hopeless. The torpedo holes in their hulls were enormous, some of them 40 feet long and 15 feet high, gaping wounds in the ship's side that had allowed thousands of tons of seawater to flood compartments that were never designed to be submerged. But the basic structure of both ships, their keels, their framing, their armor belts, was largely intact. The damage was repairable given enough time, enough steel, and enough skilled labor. Both ships were sent to the Puget Sound Navy Yard in Bremerton, Washington, where they underwent not merely repair, but complete reconstruction, emerging from the shipyard as essentially new warships that bore little resemblance to the vessels that had been sunk in December 1941. Nevada's salvage was complicated by her grounding at Hospital Point and the extensive bomb and fire damage to her superstructure, but she was refloated in February 1942 and sent to Puget Sound for reconstruction. The work on all 3 ships followed a similar pattern. The damaged hull plating was cut away and replaced. The machinery, much of which had been submerged in oily seawater for weeks or months, was either rebuilt or replaced entirely. The superstructures were torn down and redesigned, incorporating the lessons that the first months of the war had already taught about the importance of anti-aircraft defense. Where the original ships had carried a modest battery of anti-aircraft guns, the reconstructed versions bristled with dozens of 40mm Bofors and 20mm Oerlikon automatic weapons, giving them a curtain of fire that could shred an attacking aircraft at close range. New fire control radars were installed, giving the ships the ability to direct their main battery fire at night or in poor visibility, a capability that the 1941 vintage fire control systems had entirely lacked. The silhouettes of the rebuilt ships were dramatically different from their pre-war appearance, lower, more angular, cluttered with radar antennas and gun tubs that gave them a purposeful, aggressive look that their original elegant profiles had not possessed. Tennessee and Maryland, which had suffered the least damage, were repaired and returned to service more quickly, though they too underwent significant modernization. Maryland was back in action by February 1942, barely 2 months after the attack, a testament to both the limited nature of her damage and the urgency of the moment. Tennessee took longer because her reconstruction was more thorough, but she emerged from the shipyard in 1943 as a substantially more capable warship than she had been before the attack. Pennsylvania, which had been in dry dock and suffered the least damage of any battleship at Pearl Harbor, was repaired and operational within months, though she too would return to the shipyard later in the war for modernization that brought her anti-aircraft armament and fire control systems up to the standards of her rebuilt sisters. The return of these battleships to active service was one of the more remarkable achievements of the American war effort, but it also revealed a fundamental truth about the changed nature of naval warfare that the Pearl Harbor attack had demonstrated. The rebuilt battleships did not return to the role that their designers had envisioned. They did not steam in great battle lines to engage the Japanese fleet in the decisive surface action that pre-war strategists had expected. That role had been assumed by the aircraft carriers, which had proven at Coral Sea, Midway, and in the Solomons campaigns that they could project power over distances that made the battleship's 20-mile gun range seem almost quaint. Instead, the Pearl Harbor survivors found a new purpose, one that was less glamorous than the decisive fleet engagement, but arguably more important to the ultimate outcome of the war. They became the backbone of the shore bombardment force that supported every major amphibious landing in the Pacific from 1943 onward. The island-hopping campaign that carried the American military from Guadalcanal to Okinawa was fundamentally an infantry war fought on small, heavily fortified islands that the Japanese defended with a tenacity that made every landing a bloodbath. The Marines and soldiers who hit those beaches needed fire support, and the most effective fire support available was the battleship's main battery. A single 16-inch shell weighed as much as a small car and carried enough explosive to demolish a concrete bunker. A broadside from a battleship could obliterate an area the size of a football field, and the sustained fire of a bombardment group could reduce a fortified position to rubble in hours. The rebuilt Pearl Harbor battleships excelled in this role because of their slow speed. The very characteristic that had made them obsolete as fleet combatants was irrelevant when the job was to sit offshore and methodically destroy shore defenses. Their thick armor protected them from the shore batteries that the Japanese emplaced on many of the contested islands, and their large crews could sustain bombardment operations for days or weeks without relief. West Virginia's return to combat was perhaps the most symbolically powerful of all the Pearl Harbor resurrections. She had been sunk at her berth, sat on the bottom of Pearl Harbor for months, been raised, towed across the Pacific, completely rebuilt, and then sailed back across the same ocean to fight the Navy that had put her on the bottom. Her moment of vindication came at the Battle of Surigao Strait on the night of October 24, 25, 1944, the last battleship versus battleship engagement in naval history. The Japanese Southern Force, led by the battleships Yamashiro and Fuso, attempted to transit the narrow Surigao Strait to attack the American landing force at Leyte Gulf, and they sailed directly into a trap that Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf had set with exquisite precision. Waiting at the northern end of the strait was a line of 6 American battleships, 5 of them Pearl Harbor survivors, West Virginia, Maryland, Tennessee, California, and Pennsylvania. They had crossed the T of the approaching Japanese force, the classic naval maneuver in which one fleet's full broadside bears on the enemy, while the enemy can reply with only his forward guns. And they opened fire with a devastating accuracy that the radar-directed fire control systems made possible, even in the darkness of a tropical night. West Virginia's performance that night was extraordinary. Her fire control radar locked onto Yamashiro at a range of over 40,000 yards, and she opened fire with her 16-inch main battery at a range that would have been impossible for the pre-war fire control systems. Her salvos were so accurate that the fire control team had difficulty determining whether they were hitting because the target was already being pounded by hits from other ships. Within minutes, Yamashiro was ablaze, her hull punctured by 16-inch shells that detonated inside her with a violence that no amount of armor could withstand. Fuso had already been destroyed by torpedo attack earlier in the night. The Japanese Southern Force was annihilated, and the Pearl Harbor battleships had achieved the fleet engagement that their designers had always envisioned, just not in the way anyone had imagined. The fact that it happened at all was a combination of Japanese desperation and American preparation, and the fact that it would never happen again was a reflection of how completely the aircraft carrier had supplanted the battleship as the decisive weapon of naval warfare. The rebuilt Pearl Harbor battleships went on to serve throughout the remainder of the Pacific War, providing fire support at Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and dozens of smaller engagements that are less famous but were no less important to the men who fought them. California's guns pounded Japanese positions on the beaches of Lingayen Gulf in the Philippines. Tennessee's shells tore apart fortifications on Okinawa that had withstood days of aerial bombardment. Nevada, the ship that had made her desperate run down the channel on December 7th, sailed halfway around the world to provide fire support for the Normandy invasion on June 6, 1944. Her 14-inch guns hammering German positions on Utah Beach with the same weapons that Japanese bombs had tried to silence 2.5 years earlier. There is something almost unbearably poignant about the image of Nevada, scarred and rebuilt, firing her guns at the beaches of Normandy, a ship that had been counted dead now serving as the instrument of liberation on the far side of the planet from where she had been struck down. The contributions of these ships to the Allied victory were substantial, but often overlooked in histories that focus, understandably, on the carrier battles and the submarine campaign that strangled Japan's maritime supply lines. The shore bombardment role was not glamorous and did not produce the decisive, single-battle narratives that make for compelling storytelling. But the men on those beaches, the Marines at Tarawa and Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the soldiers at Leyte and Lingayen, knew what those guns meant. When a battleship's broadside crashed into a Japanese defensive position, it did more than destroy concrete and kill defenders. It broke the coherence of the defense, disrupted communications, collapsed tunnels, and created the chaos that the assault troops needed to get across the beach and into the fight on something approaching equal terms. Without the battleship's guns, the casualty rates at those landings, already horrific, would have been even worse. The war ended in August 1945, and the surviving Pearl Harbor battleships faced a future that was as uncertain as their past had been violent. The Navy no longer had any use for slow, oil-hungry capital ships in an age of carriers and, increasingly, nuclear weapons. Pennsylvania was so badly damaged by a torpedo hit late in the war that she was used as a target ship during the Bikini Atoll nuclear tests in 1946, where she survived 2 nuclear detonations with severe but non-fatal damage before being scuttled in deep water off Kwajalein in 1948, her contaminated hull too radioactive to bring home. Nevada met a similar fate, also serving as a target at Bikini and then being used for weapons testing at sea, where she proved so difficult to sink that the Navy spent 2 days firing torpedoes, shells, and bombs at her before she finally went down, a testament to the toughness that her designers had built into her 30 years earlier. The last shots fired at Nevada were from the American warships trying to scuttle her, a deeply ironic end for a ship that had survived Pearl Harbor, the Atlantic, Normandy, and the Pacific. The other survivors were decommissioned and scrapped, their steel melted down, and their guns cut apart. The physical substance of these extraordinary machines returning to the industrial stream from which they had emerged decades earlier. Tennessee was scrapped in 1959, California in 1959, Maryland in 1959 as well, West Virginia in 1959. A generation of warships that had been born in the optimism of the post-World War I era had been shattered in the catastrophe of Pearl Harbor, had been resurrected through an act of collective will and engineering genius, and had fought their way across 2 oceans to help win the greatest conflict in human history. Their service lives spanned the entire arc of the battleship era, from the Dreadnought Revolution, through the treaty limitations, through the catastrophic demonstration of air power supremacy, and finally to the last battleship engagement in history. No other group of warships can claim a story that touches so many of the defining themes of 20th century naval warfare. Arizona alone remains where she fell, her hull still visible beneath the clear waters of Pearl Harbor, still leaking oil that rises to the surface in a slow, steady sheen that the Navy calls black tears. Over the wreckage, the white memorial structure that was dedicated in 1962 straddles the sunken hull without touching it, a gesture of respect for the men who remain inside. More than 1.5 million people visit the memorial every year, standing on the platform above the water and looking down at the rusted remains of a warship that was once the pride of the Pacific Fleet. The names of the dead are inscribed on a marble wall at the far end of the memorial, 1,177 names arranged in neat rows that do not begin to convey the scale of what was lost. The oil still leaks, more than 80 years after the attack, seeping from tanks that were sealed and forgotten when the ship went down, and there is a tradition among veterans and visitors that the leaking will stop only when the last survivor of the attack has died. The last known survivor of Arizona passed away in April 2024, and yet the oil continues to seep, as if the ship itself refuses to stop bleeding for the men it could not save. What happened at Pearl Harbor on that December morning changed not just the course of a war, but the fundamental architecture of military power for every nation on Earth. The battleship, the weapon that had defined naval supremacy for 4 centuries, was dethroned in 90 minutes by aircraft that cost a fraction of a percent of the ships they destroyed. The lesson was absorbed by every navy in the world, and no nation ever again built a battleship as the centerpiece of its fleet. The aircraft carrier, and later the nuclear submarine and the guided missile, took the battleship's place, and the great armored warships that had once embodied national prestige and military might were reduced to museums, targets, and scrap metal. The last American battleships, the Iowa class, served into the 1990s in a shore bombardment role not so different from what the Pearl Harbor survivors had done 50 years earlier. But they were the end of the line, the final expression of a concept that Pearl Harbor had rendered obsolete. And yet the story of Pearl Harbor's battleships refuses to become merely historical, refuses to settle into the comfortable past tense of something that happened long ago to people who are no longer alive. The memorial above Arizona draws visitors from every country on Earth, many of them from Japan, and the questions they ask are not the questions of tourists looking at a relic. They are the questions of people trying to understand how something so massive, so powerful, so apparently invincible could be destroyed so quickly and so completely. The answer, of course, is that nothing built by human hands is invincible, and the belief that it is, the complacency that comes from trusting in the strength of what you have rather than preparing for the reality of what you face, is the most dangerous vulnerability of all. The American battleships at Pearl Harbor were not destroyed because they were weak. They were destroyed because the people responsible for them believed they were strong enough, and that belief is the one enemy that no amount of armor can defeat. Have you ever visited the Arizona Memorial? And if so, did you notice the oil still rising from the water after more than 80 years? That question alone tells you something about what those ships were made of and what was lost inside them. The next time you stand at the edge of any harbor and see a warship at anchor, remember that you are looking at a machine that exists because of what happened in Pearl Harbor, because every warship built since that morning was designed in the shadow of the lesson that December 7th burned into the consciousness of every Navy on Earth. The battleships of Pearl Harbor did not just shape a war. They shaped the world that came after, a world that still carries, like Arizona's slow black tears, the marks of what was broken on that Sunday morning in 1941. If this story moved you, leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to keep exploring the stories that shape the world we live in, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss what comes next.